A huge welcome to Blocks Up and to today's Science Talk. We're here live from Copenhagen and from the co-working space and innovation hub. And for the ones of you who don't know me, my name is Jule Rumpe, and I'm the science coordinator here in Blocks Up, and I'm also hosting this year's series of the Science Talks. We're hosting these Science Talks here at Blocks Up because we want to give science a voice and also a platform. So we're inviting inspiring speakers to come and share their knowledge with us. But before we're going to unpack the exclusion of the built environment today, I'm only going to say one more thing, which is that I really want to thank our partner for this year's series of the Science Talks, which is the International Union of Architects and the UIA World Congress of Architects. The Congress was held this year in July here in Copenhagen. Some of you might have been there. And it united architects from all over the world for 1 week inspirational events. So the Science Talks we're hosting here are framing this Congress. And therefore we also took over the theme of the Congress, which is leave no one behind. It is the universal value which is needed to reach the sustainable development goals. And we in Blocks Up, we took over that theme for the Science Talks, but we also stretched it a bit because we want to leave no one and nothing behind. But together with the UIA, we've also identified architecture and urban design as the key driver to achieve the sustainable development goals. But finally, let's shift our attention away from me and us, but to our today's speakers. Natalia and Christiane, they are first and foremost sisters. So I think, according to my knowledge, this is the first family-run science talk here at Blocks Up. So, the first time we have a talk together. Yes, this is a premiere. But besides that, Christiane holds a PhD in political philosophy from Copenhagen Business School, and where she's now also a researcher and lecturer. Natalia is an architect and head of institute at the Institute of Architecture and Royal Technology at the Royal Danish Academy. And she was also president of Congress at the UIA World Congress of Architects 2023. This combination of expertise is, in my opinion, a wonderful example of an interdisciplinary collaboration, which we at Blocks Up are highly supporting, and I also think is much needed and address the complexity of problems we're facing today. But now that's enough for me. I know you're all not here to listen to me, but you want to hear something from the two of them. The last thing I'm going to say is that, as usual, we have a Q&A session after the talk. So the ones of you online, feel free to post questions in the chat already. During the talk, we'll have my colleague Elena, who will then try to read the questions afterwards. And for the ones in the room, you are welcome to post questions in person after the talk. So now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I think thank you so much also for both for the invitation and the beautiful introduction. So I think what we can add is only to stress what you already said, that we're hoping that we can, through this talk, approach the subject of exclusion in the built environment through the dual perspectives of architecture and philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and should we go briefly through our plan for today?
We'll start. I'll get the privilege of starting briefly, talking about leaving no one behind and what we do when we build, and then over to you.
Yes, and then I will look deeper into some of the entanglements of aesthetic and political power. You had this wonderful expression, Natalie, yesterday when we talked about it, that we build our ideas. And maybe I could say also that this is one of my core interests as a political philosopher, that there are these intimate and very fundamental entanglements with between aesthetics, politics, and then our beliefs, whether that be religious beliefs or other kinds of ideas, or even modern myths being produced in so-called secular society. So these entanglements. So I'll dive deeper into that through the concept of the distribution of the sensible and some thoughts of Rangier, for instance. And then afterwards go into also the diversity of experiences of these, you could call them aesthetic, political forms of experiencing the world. So deeper into questions of embodiment and multisensory experience. and moving on to questions of, can there be one standardized model of the human being? The answer is obviously no. But what do we do with the diversity of bodies, and how do we grasp the human? And maybe we should also say in this regard that the theme of today is leaving no one behind, and exclusion and inclusion. And leaving no one behind, that could also relate to nature in general. But for purposes of, we only have 45 minutes, so we will mainly focus on human beings and inclusion and exclusion related to human beings. But that does not mean that other species and nature in general is not also extremely important.
And then we move to the Copenhagen Lessons, and back to what you said, that I think what I said was that we built our values, and maybe we should then build our values. So when we build, we reproduce the values of culture, of society, but we also have an opportunity, of course, to shape those values. And we'll get into that when we get to the Copenhagen Lessons, because that's what that first principle is all about. And then we'll give some examples, and hopefully you'll all engage in reflection for the last 15 minutes. So diving quickly into it. Leave no one behind, as you also said. It's a central transformative promise of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a big and important commitment. It's directly linked to the human rights. And as you say, then of course, and as you said, Jules, then we can expand a discussion about rights of the non-human. But again, to keep it from where it sort of stood at the adoption of the goals, it's an overarching promise of what we need to do and what we can do if we reach the 17 goals. To build is to separate. If you sort of think about what is it we do, we create an inside and an outside. We create a sort of a distinction between what's the bathroom, what's the kitchen. If you sort of think very sort of basically about what we do when we create a built environment, it's about the need to distinguish something from something else. Otherwise, we would not have to build. So we need maybe to be protected from the weather, or we need to be protected from somebody who's not part of our tribe or our city or our family. So every time we build, we create something that's inside, something that's outside, and that's. I think that's sort of an important starting point for this conversation, because there is no, you cannot discuss the built environment as if a built environment exists that do not separate. So then how do we separate, why do we separate, and whom do we separate? And what we're especially interested in when we look at the Leave No One Behind promise is, of course, people who are at risk of facing exclusion or biases, mistreatment. It could be, and I mean, this is, I'll show a few examples of that. It can have to do with class. It can be related to gender, ethnicity, religion, age, disability, and of course many other things. But these aspects of identity include a risk of being left behind. And it's built into our built environment everywhere. In an everyday, totally, in a way that's not special, can be, but can also just be totally ordinary. So to take first, class, poverty, dark design is a good way to start. It's very easy to disagree with. Why can somebody not sleep under that staircase? Somebody have specifically created a design provision here to make sure that a certain use doesn't happen. That certain use has to do with resources, with having another place to sleep or not, because people do not sleep under that staircase if they have a better option. So everywhere in buildings, it can be Can you only sit down if you can pay for a cup of coffee, or is there an option to sit down if you have no money? Can you enter the park for free? You can here in Copenhagen. There are many places in the world where the public park is a for-pay option or a private option. So that's one aspect. And this is just to illustrate, to give some images of the sort of very concrete implementation in the built environment of these distinctions and exclusions. This is an old example from Copenhagen. This is not what Copenhagen looks like anymore. It's a public toilet that provides specifically for one gender. Today, of course, a public toilet in Copenhagen provides for any gender identity. This is the wall. It's Palestine and Israel. It's a piece of built infrastructure that, of course, differentiates on the basis of nationality and ethnicity. And it's not the only one, but of course, it's a very, very strong expression of this kind of exclusion. Here, this is a reconstructed Hindu temple in Dhaka. Bangladesh is predominantly a Muslim country. This Hindu temple was partly demolished as part of a new highway overpass construction project, where properties on this in this area were expropriated, and this temple lost half of its building. But if you are a Muslim, then there is a moral obligation not to build a sacred space for another religion. That made it complicated for the community activists who wanted to help the Hindu community rebuild this building and make it again a temple. Because how do you build if you cannot find an engineer who feels that they can engage with the project because it's a sacred space of another religion? And disability, this is an example of a lovely space here in Copenhagen, full of good intentions, good design qualities, but still, if you are not walking very well, if you are in walking with a cane or with other difficulties, then this decoration with the uneven parts is not helping you. So here we have something it's not dark design. It has a quality design properties in many ways, but it might still make it more difficult for a certain group of users to use this path and enjoy it. So again, to say that how we exclude is not it might be intentional, as in that first picture, and it might be a small part of another intention, but it could still be there. And here is also to follow on the other picture. Here is an image of something that's really nice and well intended. It's sidewalk cafes in New York. This is from 21. So post-pandemic, let's create opportunities for people to socialize and meet outdoors. Wonderful idea. But then when you want to create that feeling of this being a special space, it's not just a sidewalk. You make a nice wooden deck, but it's also a barrier for people to, if you're in a wheelchair, or if you require a bit more space, if you are there with a pram, you cannot actually get into that space. So again, something that has a lot of positive attributes, but still becomes a barrier for a certain part of the citizenry. So these first pictures, they're not, of course, it is not a full story, but our basic point here is simply to say that these separations, big and small, everyday and more dramatic, more politically purposeful or violent, they are everywhere around us. And to start to discuss exclusion in the built environment, we need to start seeing it in all its aspects.
Yes, then I'll go on here. So yes, so how from a philosophical perspective can we approach this relation between, on the one hand, spatial or temporal distinctions, and then issues of exclusion and inclusion? And there, from the point of view of philosophy, there could be many different paths into this question, and some of you might know various theoretical paths into that question. But here I would like to introduce the concept or the notion of the distribution of the sensible, formulated by Jacques Rancière, a French philosopher. And yes, this concept, and I think this offers a quite striking and fruitful theoretical approach, but I will also integrate other theoretical perspectives later. So this concept, the distribution of the sensible, in a certain way, it's quite simple, and then in other ways, it's extremely complex how he unfolds it. But the basic idea is that the way we perceive a space, time, the sensible in general, it's not just natural. So, for instance, when I look in this room, when I perceive this room, there are all sorts of things that guide my perception. So I perceive us as speakers, you as a kind of audience. You could say there's kind of an invisible line here. I distinguish between different people. I distinguish between the human and the non-human. Maybe I have ideas about what is artificial or not. I distinguish between what I see as hard lines or soft lines, clear or blurry boundaries, various, and all this also entails certain hierarchies and certain organizations of space, and the same goes for time. So this is, so Rancière would say, and many other philosophers would say, the way I perceive this room is not just a matter of this is the only natural way to perceive a room. There are certain historical regimes of perception. You might say, here I call it aesthetic regimes. For those of you who know Rancière very well, he also has a more specific concept of aesthetic regime as a particular regime of art, in contrast to other regimes of art. So just so that that does not confuse. But here, aesthetic regimes just generally mean how is the sensible organized when we perceive a room, a building, an urban environment, nature, and so forth. And this is historically contingent. It's subject to historical change. And then you might also say, well, how are these various distinctions, these forms of perception, how is that produced? Well, architecture or urban planning or other forms of societal organization, infrastructure, etc., plays a huge part in the production of these regimes of perception, but also art, which is maybe what Rancière has dealt mostly with himself, may play a huge part in these regimes of perception. And that, of course, also opens this difficult question of, well, do we all then perceive the same? And a core point for us is, of course, that we do not. So there's a very complex relationship between different forms of life, and then these more overall complex regimes of perception. But to some extent, and maybe we cannot use Rancière all the way in order to go into these complexities. But I think to some extent, Rancière takes this into account because he would say generally that these aesthetic distinctions, that is, ways of organizing the sensible, are crucial to what we notice at all and what we do not notice. So what is being seen and what is not being seen is in a way invisible. What can be heard or what is more considered as background noise or as silence or as music, and etc. What can be touched, what is untouchable, generally what can be sensed, felt, noticed, experienced, and so on. And this, of course, also implies that that can be a hierarchy of the senses, different senses. So the visual may play a more prominent role than the audible or touch and smell and so on. And that's also an issue which is very important to issues of inclusion. So basically, these distinctions, aesthetic distinctions in this broad sense of distinctions within the sensible, are politically crucial in the sense that they are crucial for who, which people, and what, which forms of life, which aspects of life are being noticed or not noticed, what hierarchies are established within all these different elements within the sensible, who or what has a right to speak, to be seen, to act in a certain way, have a particular status in a room, for instance, who are excluded and ignored. And that means that even if to some extent we may talk about a particular regime of perception being dominated in a particular place and time, different people in different situations will experience these regimes differently according to whether they are comfortable within these regimes, whether their bodies are comfortable within these regimes or not, whether they are excluded or not, or the forms of life they associate with are excluded or ignored or brought forward or not. And maybe just one remark about the relationship, Rancher's relationship to architecture, because certainly he has dealt more with or written more about aesthetic regimes in this sense, distribution of the sensible in relation to art, literature, film, theater, painting, for instance, than he has dealt with architecture. But increasingly within the last 5, 6, 7 years, he has had various exchanges with architects. And if you're interested in diving deeper into this, you can just Google architecture exchange Jacques Rancher, and you can find some roundtables, some lectures, and so on. And also here, the questions of the relationship between art and architecture is dealt with. And some would say, well, art is very different from architecture, but Jacques Rancher actually says that in a sense, architecture was always the ideal model for art, while simultaneously constituting a very specific form of art. And he would also say that this relationship between art and life, which is a sort of a core point for him, is art something that just represents life, or is it a form of life itself? And again, what's the relationship between planning or making a figure, a drawing, etc., and then the lived life? When it comes to these issues, architecture is, in a sense, closer to life, and in another sense, has a much more complex relationship to life than other art forms. I leave it with that, because that's where it becomes very complex. Yeah.
And I know we have many more things we want to.
Do you want to add something here?
No. Let's carry on.
Carry on to the next slide. So also just one last note of Rancher's theory before I go into some examples, which are more my own examples than Rancher's examples. Just to take to note of the fact that now I have talked about politics in a very broad sense, but he actually distinguishes between policing, so that would be what we often would call politics. He would call that policing, and then politics. So I can just read the quote. The essence of the police, this is not police in the normal, ordinary sense of the police. The essence of the police lies neither in repression nor even in control over the living. Its essence lies in a certain way of dividing up the sensible. I call distribution of the sensible a generally implicit law that defines the forms of partaking by first defining the modes of perception in which they are inscribed. So again, different human being, different forms of life, different aspects of life. Do they belong in particular rooms, spaces, times, etc., or do they have no belonging? And to the extent they have no belonging or no part of it, which would also be Angers' concept of that, politics, it would be the effort to disrupt the established regimes of perception, these entanglements of political and aesthetic power, and through dissent, through contestation, and so as to establish sort of new ways of distributing the sensible. So, and also for this reason, art can be very important because it can create new ways of organizing time and space and new hierarchies of the sensible. Yes. So, and the following is, I mean, some of these distinctions, you could find them dealt with by Ringer himself, but a lot of it is also just my own way of thinking with this concept of the distribution of the sensible. So these are, and the list could be much longer, but these are just some, I would say, core examples of how, again, distinctions established spatially and temporally also correspond to important political, institutional, cultural, legal distinctions, in short, important social distinctions. And again, some of these distinctions would, like public, private, and sacred, profane, they would be important in many times and in many places, but it's important to say that, of course, the content, what is meant by these concepts, and also the distinction between them, the nature of the distinction, is it sort of blurry distinctions or hard distinctions, that changes historically very much. And then there are some of the other distinctions which are maybe more particular. For instance, if we talk about rationality, irrationality, normality, sickness, criminality, human, inhuman, nature, culture, I would say they're quite specific to modernity. And again, due to time, I'll not go too deeply into it. But in the 19th century, I think we could talk about something called a general civilization logic that penetrated science, cultural thinking, arts, political thinking, legal thinking, etc., medical thinking. And that was a quite, a colonial and racist and patriarchic thinking to a large extent, and which would use distinctions like that, and maybe it could also be added other distinctions such as individual versus irrational masses, or child versus adult, or science versus faith, human versus animal, or educated versus uneducated. And even if much has changed since the 19th century, I would say that remnants of these distinctions, or maybe a different interpretation of them, but still remnants of these distinctions can still be found, for instance, in some of the core disciplinary institutions of also democratic societies like the Danish one. So courts, prisons, schools, and also hospitals are often based on quite particular spatial and temporal designs and distinctions externally and internally, which corresponds to particular roles and forms of conduct and forms of access and status and rights and visibility and invisibility, etc. And if spatial experiments are being made, and I know they're being made, for instance, new design, non-traditional designs for schoolrooms or for prisons, for instance, that also changes roles and power mechanisms. Yes, and refugee camps and refugee centers, that could be expressions of quite hard distinctions, spatially and legally, politically, culturally, and Guantanamo in the bottom here would be a very extreme example of distinctions, which also you all know, I'm sure, the example, but that also involves distinctions between what is human and considered non-human or inhuman. So, but moving on to some more specific...
With the added complexity of this being then American land on Cuba.
Yeah. So there are a lot of legal complexities involved.
Yeah, and distinctions between national domain.
So, but I have some maybe more funny and more specific examples to flesh it out a little bit more. There's this, I think, it's still quite interesting movie, The Phantom of Liberty by Louis Buñuel from 1974. And here's just a clip I've taken from YouTube. And if you can see the picture, you can see that it looks very much like an ordinary bourgeois dinner party, only the guests they sit on toilets instead of sitting on normal chairs. And then it also occurs that sometimes one guest discreetly leaves the dinner party and goes to a separate room, locks the door, and sort of discreetly eats dinner in this situation. So it's, in a way, it's very, very simple. Buñuel just switches around, sitting on the toilet and eating dinner, and suddenly sitting on the toilet is something you do in common together with other people, and eating dinner is something you do very much alone, sort of in a secured space with nobody else watching. So in that sense, it's a very simple switch. But you could say what is kept is, of course, that we distinguish between something which is private and something which is public, something which is potentially shameful, at least if it was witnessed by others, and something which is more honorable or exposed. And there are some issues also related to what is considered waste, and what is considered useful. And also, if you see the whole clip, there are discussions about waste going on and what is ugly and so on in this conversation. So even though it's in a way very simple, if you take the whole context into account, it's quite a sophisticated reflection, actually, on some of these distinctions. And then the next one, sacred spaces, that's an extremely interesting subject as well, and that will also differentiate, be very different from religion to religion, and also to sacred spaces on secular grounds and so on, how a sacred space is interpreted, what you can do in a sacred space, etc. But just to take some churches in Copenhagen, Mariakirken and Brorsons Kirke, there have been actually a lot of debate related to how sacred space can be interpreted. For instance, can expel individuals due to rejection of applications for residence or refugee status. It can expel individuals be in a sacred space. Can the police enter that space and take them out by force? But also, is the sacred space, is that a space for vulnerable groups more generally? And are sacred spaces also places where you can have more so-called profane activities, concert, dinner, kids playing, etc. So that's also an interesting, there are a lot of interesting reflections as to sacred space. Non-places, we talked quite a lot about that, because that's a sort of a particular concept within, I think, springing from anthropology, that some places are non-places versus other places which has character enough, or individuality enough, or spirit enough, identity enough in order to be called a space. And we both agree that, in fact, there are no non-places. All spaces are places in a certain sense, but there's, of course, a huge debate, the relationship between space and place. But here you have Bispeengboen as
one of the few highway overpasses in Copenhagen, and a very debated space, both hated and loved. Loved because it's been a space that had been open for being sort of taken over or interpreted in new ways. Disliked for the connotation to sort of both the car city of the overpass, but also the darkness or sort of lack of safety associated with passing under a highway overpass. But I think in Copenhagen, due to initiatives both coming from a city level and from a grassroots level, this specific space, which we here show from some years ago, is in many ways now a valuable space for citizen expression in Copenhagen, which also sort of illustrates the question of value having to do with the use, with the culture, and with a moment in time.
Yes, and usually non-places, it's used in connection with sort of places where people just pass through quickly, airports, train stations, or deserted industrial areas and stuff like that.
We are 10 minutes before the debate.
Oh, okay. Then I'll be quick. But yeah, exactly. But these such so-called non-places can be very powerful, actually, because they have these more maybe ghostly elements. Exactly because they're not over-designed. But yeah, we can come back to that in the debate. So I'll just quickly run through the other examples. We have some images from a great film festival. There are 300 films on this website, CAF-X Film Mosaic, it's called. And this short movie is from Hong Kong, called Docking. And it is, otherwise homeless people who settle or create small homes in a pier in Hong Kong, a public transportation hub. And you can see, and then they are moved away by the police, and then they move back, and so on. And you can see how they try to make it homely.
But what we should say is what you see here in the movie, and you should really go see it. It's 3 minutes. It's beautifully narrated. And many of these films from the Film Mosaic are exploring Leave No One Behind in very interesting, both artistic and practical ways. So it's worth to go visit. This is the winner of the Film Mosaic. Could you also say that? And this moment, what you see here is mid-destruction. This is in the middle of the city official moving these people's properties, sort of few belongings away, few pieces of plywood, a few blankets. They don't have a lot, but still in the few things they have managed to pull together to create a feeling of home in this temporary setting, what you see is, in the artwork here, what you see is that even with very, very few resources, a huge effort to create identity, belonging, homeliness, and it's just torn down. It's a very touching movie.
And another movie from the same festival, that it's how it's quite difficult to be queer in Azerbaijan, Baku, but the main character in the film tells about this underground toilet where he can meet his partners, and it's a kind of a kingdom, but then again it's very ambiguous or melancholic, because he finds out that 40 years ago it was the same, it played the same role. So people, queer people had to meet their partners underground. So again, this reflection of public, private space, what's honorable, what's kept away, etc. Oh. Yeah, I guess I have to do this very quickly.
We're down to 5 minutes.
Yeah, a lot of you are probably know this concept of atmosphere, formulated by Gernot Böhne, building on earlier phenomenological approaches. And the point of this we want to make here is again just firstly, then experiences of built environment is a multisensory experience. It also involves affective registers, and it involves the body. And can we, so again coming back to this question of even if there are something which is created and produced commonly or generally in a specific time and place, at the same time, there are all these very, very diverse experiences, which has to do with the multisensory, with diverse bodies, diverse affective registers, even diverse unconscious fantasies and future expectations and so on. And of course, so these are rhetorical questions. Can we take all that into account? Well, naturally not. We cannot take all possible diverse experiences into account, but we can know that this is the way it is, that this diversity exists. This is just a beautiful quote about how I perceive in a total way with my whole being. And here I think are some also nice quotes exploring these diverse experiences from different points of view. The first one, quite important: physical access leads to social access. Sarah Ahmed's article on how whiteness is experienced both for white people who do not experience, for whom whiteness may be invisible, and which means that their bodies can be comfortable in a room, and also how it can be experienced for people of color. So I can only recommend that article. And I'll just take the last, and there's something about silence and speaking and noise, but I'll just take the last quote. I'm a visual person, I just can't see. An amazing blind photographer, Pete Eckert, and I can also just recommend that you go to his website and see some of these fantastic photographs that he makes. And he talks about his inner visions. And it's also very interesting how he works with light painting and an old camera and echo sounds, etc. So, yeah, very, sorry. Oh, that was wrong.
Yeah, you have to go back.
Yeah. So this also just means that we cannot take as a starting point this standard model of a human being. I mean, it's long ago that has been noted, but how can we take into account the different the diversity of bodies? And again, a philosopher, very known feminist philosopher, Judith Butler, criticizes this idea of the self-sufficient or normal individual. And yes, here's a quite beautiful a film also from a movie called Examined Life, where Judith Butler and Sonora Taylor, a writer and activist and painter, discusses what it means to walk in a city, and also discusses issues of what is human. And Taylor, for instance, tells that she's bound to a wheelchair, how earlier in her life people would say she walked like a monkey, and she knew that that was meant dehumanizing and degrading. But then also she says, well, in fact, monkeys, that's my favorite animal. So in fact, I took it as a compliment. But there's some very fine observations.
That's a recommendation as well.
Yes. Maybe we should go to...
Yeah, We are
some of the
because we are at the 45, so we'll maybe eat 5 minutes of the debate. Apologize for that because we really want the conversation as well. The Copenhagen Lessons are put together as a result of the World Congress of Architects mentioned in the beginning of this talk by Jule, and also of course of all the input and knowledge that went into the Congress, but also of all the knowledge and input that went into the years up to the Congress, where the partners and the many networks supporting the Congress through the science track, the next generation track, the practice track, many wonderful people, wonderful viewpoints from all over the world came together and helped us make the conversation that the Congress was, but also all that inspiration informed these principles, which we presented at the closing of the Congress. So the first, dignity and agency for all people is fundamental in architecture. There is no beauty in exclusion. You could say, going back to where we started, that when we built representations of values, of ideas of society, of ideas of what a home looks like, and the idea of what a bank looks like, the idea of what a architecture look like, idea of what is a public park, how do we build in how we think, how we believe that these different facilities should be placed in the urban context, how they should be used, who should be used them. There's a lot of, as I think you have crammed into short these the remarks which you just gave, Christiane. All those ideas, values, cultural understandings, we built that into everything we built in the built environment. And that means that when we build, we have to strive to see what we don't see, to experience other viewpoints, reflect on what are the distinctions we're making. But it also means that we have to work on our culture and values. We have to build that too, because only if we manage, and that's not it's a big thing, but it's also necessary for the sustainable development, that we simply manage to also design, build, move, nudge, push culture and values to new places. So this first principle is about that. It's about, if we all agree about that, then we build from a different place, and then what we build will be something else. So that's sort of the intention, and then we hope there's time to discuss whether a principle like that can work, how we can work with it, can we even work with it, how is such a principle, if we can work with it to implement it, what does that look like? And then I just wanted to finish up super quick because we started out presenting everyday examples of either non-intentional or intentional divisions, risking or willingly or sort of strongly ensuring that there are divisions between different users. We just wanted to conclude by also showing some examples of great projects, great efforts to pull in a different direction, to pull towards the realization of that first principle. And this is a habitat for orphan girls in Iran. They are a high-risk group. So this house gives them a protective, stable home. It's a safe space, and it's placed prominently in the center of the city, emphasizing this group of very vulnerable citizens' right to be treated as equal citizens. So the question this helped to address is attempts to, or answers to, or to find out how we can create spaces that shield instead of hide vulnerable people. This is not, of course, the only or final solution. You would also dream of a day when this group of citizens would not need to be shielded, because being an orphan, being a girl, would not need shielding. But for now, this is doing a great difference for this group of girls. It provides protection for a group at risk of being left behind. Inclusivity. can we extend people's ability to engage in and contribute to society? This is a great village in Japan called Shire Kanazawa. Japan has the oldest population in the world and a negative population growth. By designing affordable, accessible villages in the outskirts of cities, people who are elderly or have special needs can stay active and have a full activity in society in a different way, longer, and with a more full palette of activities. So it gives agency, it gives a different kind of social life. And then students, families, and many other people can get a low-rent housing, which means that you create communities of many different users and a sort of hopefully an inclusive social life for everybody who lives there. Acknowledgement. Can we create spaces that help people meet, process, and contemplate? This is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama in the US. Slavery, lynching, and racial terror is part of American history. And the racial inequality still divides US society today. This memorial acknowledges the more than 4,000 documented deaths of people who lost their life to lynching. It's a powerful piece of architecture. It's a contemplative space for thinking and reflecting, and a way for each of the counties where lynchings happened to take responsibility for their past, because each of these columns have inscribed names of people who in a certain county were lynched. Each column has a twin placed in the grounds outside. When the county is ready, they can take it home and make a monument locally. So eventually you will see some disappearing, you will see others remain, and you will see which remain. So it's also a way to try to sort of not just gently say we need a conversation, but to sort of build visible elements, architectural elements into forcing that conversation and making it visible who's not taking that conversation. Dignity through safety. We can develop infrastructure that democratizes access to communities. This is a light box. It's a public restroom for women in Mumbai that serves both as critical infrastructure, a safe space, and a social meeting space. Because if you cannot safely go to the toilet or wait between two buses, then you cannot take a job. Then you cannot support your family. Then you lose agency and interaction with society. Belonging temporarily. What can we do to generate a sense of home even in temporarily undefined situations? And the two examples here are a playground in a refugee camp in Libya, and gardening kits for the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Most of the Rohingya come from a farming background. They have moved into a huge refugee camp with closed, what you call the parameters. You cannot move to the outside world. There's no space. There's no jobs. You subside on the UN help on dried foods. But with these gardening kits, even in this very limited space, citizens, residents of this camp can use their skills to help provide more healthily for their families, but also regain an active part in creating creating a life and a home in this very difficult situation. So these were, again, just like where we started out. This is sort of these are big discussions to unpack. But we wanted to also end by showing examples of people, of realized architectural projects, and the many people behind them that actively work to create something we need to counter the exclusion in the built environment, that provides for people who are already left behind or at risk of being left behind, and then, of course, often are not able to address the full systemic problem of the Rohingyas even being kept for what will look like a lifetime in the refugee camp, but are still able to contribute into that situation with something that address the needs and the agency and the feeling of belonging. So on that note, we're ready for the debate, I think.
Yeah. If there are any questions.
Yeah, we are getting you back on stage.
Well, I would say first, let's give them a huge applause. And we have about 6 minutes.
Sorry about that.
Questions are welcome, just not too extended. Are there any questions online? Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to give you like half a minute to reflect first a bit and maybe talk to your neighbors about what you've just heard. You'll have some chance to drink some water and then we'll start the round. So 30 seconds. Free to talk to each other. It's also a network.
And we can certainly say something. We had fun.
Yes. I think that was quick 30 seconds, but I see something was cooking up here in the front. So any reflections or comments? Doesn't have to be a big question. Wait, I'm coming with the microphone. So.
I was just thinking, I'm working a lot with welfare management, and I think there are parallel things going on. And for instance, Skanderborg municipality, they are saying we want to be a municipality 3.0, and they are saying there's no municipality, there's just a community, and the effect is that you leave nobody behind, but you also include them who are not very, who don't want to be included. Isn't there also an, can you allow being outside?
Yes, certainly, but I would say it's a privileged position. If you have the, it's a privileged position to say, well, thank you, but I don't want that. But then you had the offer, and then you have the right to accept it or decline. And it's actually extremely important to respect the no thank you. And that's also, there's a lot of dignity in being allowed to say no thank you. So I think it's important, of course, to think about that and to give people the privilege, the power to say no.
I'm coming to the back.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to add a philosopher into this conversation, because normally if I go to events where we discuss inclusion or universal design, it often focuses on solutions. And I think what you do, Christiane, is that you add even more complexity, which also makes it more difficult to sort of comprehend what the right way to go about it is, because it is very much a gray zone, I think, in terms of not finding a one-size-fits-all, like an urban space where everyone can access, but finding equal access to urban space for every user group. So a non-programmed or a very lightly programmed space, in my opinion, would not be what to strive for. But could you maybe talk a little bit about how to go about noticing or taking into account in an equal and dignified way every user group when discussing this topic? Because I think everyone has blind spots, and it just makes it very complex to add that to the conversation. Yeah, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I can begin maybe, and you can add. Well, that's a great comment, and you're completely right that we don't have any final solutions. We talked about that the last days. Do we have any solutions? Yeah, but it is rather, if there is a solution, it is actually being aware of all these complexities, because also, as we write here, distinctions are not necessarily bad in themselves, or dividing groups of functions or life aspects. That's not necessarily bad in itself. In some cases, it can be protections, it can be dignity, as you also mentioned before. But just being aware of all these deeper implications such distinctions or other kind of spatial, temporal hierarchies or forms of organization have, and again, the diversity of experiences, that's important. But again, and I know also there are a lot going on right now in terms of connecting groups and functions which were, due to modern differentiation, etc., previously maybe separated. And that can be great to in many ways, but it's not necessarily the solution in all cases.
I'd just like to, and then I think we're sort of, I can see that we are running out of time, but if we go back to the leave no one behind, that's central to the transformative promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. They come with a strategy, and it's reaching the furthest behind first. So whenever we do something, when we build, when we program, think about it. Think about who are those furthest behind in this context, in this park, in this school. And maybe there'll be blind spots. Maybe we won't get all the way, but to think about it, to think about how can we reach those furthest behind in this activity, I think that will be one part of what we can do, because that the user groups will also change, and there will be somebody who don't want to be part of any of the user groups. So we also have to keep an open mind for the many forms of human lives that we may not be able to all anticipate or program for, but that we should respect and care about. So so to sort of try to think about who are those, how can we reach the furthest behind first here? I think that's important. And then another thing is to continue to exchange and talk between disciplines, between different cultures, because that's also how we find and move in regard to our own blind spots. We can't do that alone.
Yes, as you said, open architecture, open forms of planning where a lot is left to the users, that can be wonderful in some ways, because you don't need to anticipate all life forms, all functions, all groups, etc. But also there can be a danger in that, because who will then define this open space? Maybe the most powerful users. So again, there's a balance there between planning and non-planning.
I think we take that as the last word for today. Mm-hmm. I'm really sorry that I have to end this discussion, but I'm sure maybe you will stick around a bit. So for the ones in the room, maybe you can ask them 2 more questions over a drink here. But otherwise, before we give you a last applause, I'm going to have to be selfish and take the last word, because there's 2 events that I would like to announce. Because on September 13th, here in Blocksap, we'll host an event about financing affordable housing in the green transition. It's going to be a workshop where we're collaborating with the Institute for Human Rights in Business. So if you're interested, you can go to our Blocksap website on the event webpage and you can sign up for the event. And then, of course, our next science talk, which will be on September 7th, again here in Blocksap and online, where Lone Pfeiffer and her 2 researchers will talk about the pioneering approach of living places by Velux. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and see you next time.
Thank you.